Good morning, everyone. I'm just gonna let a few people come in for the next few minutes. Hello, everybody. I think there's still more people coming in. Give it 2 more minutes. Start. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jinge. I am the Senior Advocacy Officer based at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. I am going to be the moderator for today's discussion. Today, more than anything, we are going to be looking at the Afrobarometer scorecards, which are set to sort of track progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. As we all know, these SDGs, or rather these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, were sort of adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. More than anything, they are expected to sort of drive national and global development agendas in respective countries or other respective regions for the next decade. And they are mostly universal, or a universal call to action to one, end poverty, protect the planet, and also sort of ensure all people enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. So now it's sort of been 6 years down the line since these sort of 17 SDGs have been adopted. What we're trying to understand and unpack today is how close is Africa to achieving these sustainable development goals, right? So what Afrobarometer sort of did is to launch the SDG scorecards in May to track 12, to sort of track 12 or to sort of track 12 of the 17 SDGs, right? The AV sort of after that began a series of regional webinars to discuss the country's scorecards in details. And today's discussion rather is the fourth and final edition of these webinars. And we're going to be focusing, or rather focusing more or showing a spotlight more on Southern African countries, which is Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Mauritius, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. As I mentioned, I'm joined by a number of incredible people on the panel today. Firstly, we have Mandipa Ndlovu, who's a governance and policy researcher from the University of Leiden and Edinburgh. We also have Dion Shekuza, who's a youth advocate for sustainable development. We're also joined by Dr. Malebo Bakwena, who's the head of Department of Economics at the University of Botswana. But the first session of today's sort of discussion will begin with the presentation by Dominique Dryden, who is the Afrobarometer project manager for Southern Africa. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. Just a few house rules before we begin with Dominique's presentation on the SDG scorecards. The session is currently being live streamed on YouTube and on Facebook. Please feel free to tag Afrobarometer on social media and using the hashtag #VoicesAfrica and hashtag SDGs. Again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature on the webinar. I will read these questions, and some of them will also be forwarded to me by some of my Afrobarometer colleagues as well. So thank you so much. As I mentioned, Dominique, over to you.
Thank you so much, Gugu, and good morning, afternoon. I don't know where everybody is tuning in from around the world, but I would also like to echo Gugu in welcoming you all to today's event. I'll be presenting the Afrobarometer SDG scorecards for Southern Africa, and I'm really looking forward to the vibrant discussion which will follow. To give you a brief overview of my presentation, I will first briefly introduce the SDGs and the contribution that Afrobarometer brings to SDG tracking. I will then briefly explain how we have done this. This will be followed by spotlighting a few findings from the Afrobarometer scorecards, after which I'll present the progress or lack thereof. Next slide, Josephine. As many of you know, in 2015, UN member states adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, and the SDGs are expected to drive national and global development agendas. Tracking progress towards these goals is challenging, but essential for informing policy decisions. Many indicators and scorecards are currently being used to track SDGs. However, Afrobarometer, a Pan-African survey research network, makes a unique contribution by providing a frequently overlooked perspective, and that is that of the ordinary citizen. The Afrobarometer SDG scorecards reflect citizens' experiences and evaluations of their country's performance on several SDG priorities, and that can be compared to official UN tracking indicators. Meeting the SDG targets means making life better for people. Thus, our measurements will be incomplete if we do not include an assessment by the people whose lives we hope to impact. As such, we see the Afrobarometer SDG scorecards as a complement to existing SDG trackers by providing the people's assessment of progress towards achieving the SDGs. From repeated national surveys in up to 39 countries across Africa, Afrobarometer has data to track progress on 12 of the 17 SDGs, as shown on your screen. Our signature topics include democracy and governance. These are directly relevant to SDG 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions. But we also have data on poverty, health, education, energy supply, water and sanitation, infrastructure, gender, and inequality, among many other topics relevant to the SDGs. Next slide. Afrobarometer has completed 8 rounds of surveys between 1999 and 2021. Round 8 surveys covered 34 countries, and we are in the early phase of planning for round 9. I should also note here that all results can be disaggregated by several socio-demographic characteristics, such as gender, age, education, and economic status, among many others. Moving on to the scorecards and how we have put them together. Next slide. Here we see a few examples of how Afrobarometer indicators can contribute to measuring progress towards the SDGs. For goal 16, which aligns strongly with our signature topics, as I mentioned, our data can track many indicators, including promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels, as shown in column 1. The second column here shows the relevant SDG indicator to which we can contribute. And the third column lists Afrobarometer indicators that can help measure progress towards that particular goal. Next slide. For SDG 1, for SDG 1, our well-established Live Poverty Index is a useful indicator, and its component measure of the frequency of going without food is directly relevant to SDG 2, which is ending hunger and malnutrition. to track progress towards good health and well-being for all, which is SDG 3, we have data on how often people had to go without needed healthcare, how easy or difficult they found it to get healthcare, and how often they had to pay a bribe in accessing healthcare. For many of these indicators, we have for each SDG, we have selected one or two indicators that best capture the key objectives of the SDG, and these are what we use to construct our SDG scorecards. I will now walk you through a selection of country scorecards. We present the scorecards in two formats. Firstly, the detailed indicators showing over time trends in each country. And secondly, a summary page for each country using stoplights, which I will describe shortly when I get to that part. In the interest of time, I will show you just a few pages per country. The complete set will be published on our website, and I will share those details at the end of my presentation. So if we look at Botswana first, excuse me, the proportion of Botswana experiencing moderate or high-lived poverty has improved significantly since 2008, from 49% to 38% in 2019. If we look at SDG 2, which is zero hunger, the proportion who say that they went without enough food many times or always in the past year has declined by half since 2014, from 17% to 8%. Moving on to Zimbabwe, excuse me, we see that the proportion of Zimbabweans who went without needed medical care many times always was almost tripled since 2014. And looking at education, since 2008, the proportion of men and women with access to higher education has increased, but women continue to trail behind men. If we look at Eswatini now, specifically honing in on gender equality, in Eswatini, the use of mobile phones and the internet among men and women has increased continuously since 2008, and women are now at par with men in the usage of both. However, with regards to financial decision-making power in the household, we see that while the proportion of women who say that they make the financial decisions themselves has increased, the overall total of women who are involved in financial decision-making has decreased. Looking at Lesotho, when we look specifically at the top left panel, we see that in Lesotho, the proportion who went without enough clean water many times or always during the previous year has increased since 2014 from 21% to 30%. And looking at affordable and clean energy, SDG 7, Lesotho has clearly made progress on providing reliable electricity, though about half of citizens still lack access to electricity. When looking at SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, compared to 2014, unemployment for both men and women and the gender gap in unemployment have remained pretty much unchanged. If we look at Mozambique, focusing specifically on SDG 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, there has been an increase in the presence of schools and cell phone services in communities. Access to clinics and tarred roads has also increased, but unfortunately still remains low. In Namibia, focusing on SDG 10, reduced inequalities, looking first at economic inequality, the top left panel. In Namibia, the number of people who experienced moderate or high lived poverty has nearly doubled since 2014, from 24% to 48%. However, when looking at ethnic inequalities, Namibia has made significant progress. The proportion who say that members of their ethnic group are never treated unfairly by the government has doubled since 2008 from 30% or 29% to 58%. Staying with Namibia now, looking at climate change, Namibia has made progress on climate change. Awareness of climate change and the understanding of the negative impact of climate change have both increased significantly over time. Moving on to South Africa. In South Africa, there has, next slide, thanks. In South Africa, there's been a decline in trust in state institutions, the police, the judiciary, and parliament since 2015. Perceived corruption among these institutions has also increased. These are just some examples of the trends in country level progress or retreat that we show for each SDG in each country. On the first page of the scorecard, when you do eventually have a look, we summarize the country's performance on each indicator by using colored circles, or what we call stoplights. These stoplights illustrate changes, both progress or retreat, over roughly the past 5 years, from round 6, which was conducted between 2014 and 2015, to round 8, which was conducted between 2019 and 2021. For climate action, which is SDG 13, and bribes for public services, which is related to SDG 16, we don't have data from round 6. So when we are speaking about those particular indicators, we look at the change between round 7, which was conducted between 2016 and 2018, and round 8. So what do these stoplights actually represent? The red stoplight means that the country's performance worsened by more than 3 percentage points over that particular time span. Yellow means that there has been no change, basically that the change has been between -3 and +3 percentage points, which is not statistically significant. The green means that the performance improved by more than 3 percentage points. And the blue means that the country is already meeting this particular target. So in short, yellow worsening, red worsening, yellow stayed the same, green improving, blue meeting the target. We also have half circles. And these half circles, so it will either be half red or half green, as indicated there. Previous slide, please. These half circles indicate different levels of progress on different aspects of an indicator. For instance, if education improved for men, but worsened or stagnated for women, these findings would be represented by half circles. Before I actually get into the country summary pages, I also just want to note that these scorecards aren't intended to compare countries against one another, but rather track progress or retreat within each country over time. So just keep that in mind as we go through each country in a little bit more detail. So first we see Botswana. Botswana has made great progress towards SDG 5, gender equality. Men and women are essentially equal when it comes to financial control and are moving towards equality in the use of mobile phones and the internet. Botswana is also doing better than it was 5 years ago on reducing poverty and hunger and reducing economic and ethnic inequalities, among others. However, the country has slipped when it comes to access to medical care and clean water, reducing gender gaps in employment and promoting institutional trust. Moving on to Eswatini. Eswatini has achieved gender equality in technology use. The country has also made progress on access to infrastructure and partial progress on access to quality education, and electricity. But it is slipping on several indicators, including poverty, hunger, gender equality, and financial control, as well as access to medical care and clean water. Unemployment has also worsened, and the gender gap in unemployment remains unchanged. Lesotho is one of the few countries achieving gender equality on both indicators for SDG 5, which are in technology use and in financial control. The country is making progress on climate action and increasing access to education and electricity. However, poverty and hunger are worsening. The country is also doing worse on reducing payment of bribes for public services. Trust in state institutions has declined, and perceived corruption among these institutions has increased. In Mozambique, we see that Mozambique is doing worse on poverty, hunger, unemployment, and the gender gap in unemployment. The country is also doing partially worse on education, gender equality, in the use of technology, and access to electricity. Several other indicators show mixed results. While trust in state institutions has increased, perceived corruption among these institutions has partially worsened. The payment of bribes for public services has also worsened. Awareness of climate change has decreased, though among those who have heard of climate change, more are aware of its negative effects. The country is also doing worse in reducing economic inequalities, though ethnic inequalities have decreased. Moving on to Namibia now. Namibia is achieving gender equality in employment. The country is also doing better on climate action and reducing ethnic inequalities, but it is experiencing worsening poverty, hunger, access to clean water, unemployment, economic inequalities, and challenges related to access to healthcare. Payment of bribes for public services has remained stagnant. Trust in state institutions has worsened, and there's been mixed progress on perceived corruption among institutions. South Africa has only made progress on climate action. The country is doing worse than 5 years ago on most of these indicators, including poverty, hunger, health, unemployment, economic inequalities, trust and perceived corruption in institutions. Access to clean water and electricity has also worsened. The country has made no progress on gender inequality, increasing access to education, and reducing payment of bribes for public services. Again, I just want to repeat that all these stoplights don't necessarily, particularly in South Africa's case, these red stoplights don't necessarily mean that South Africa is performing worse than other countries that I've already spoken about on these indicators, but rather that it is performing worse than it was 5 years ago. Finally, I want to look at Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is, a second. Next slide, please. Thanks. Zimbabwe is making progress on climate action as well as access to education and electricity. On gender equality, the country is doing better on equality in technology use, but is making only partial progress on ensuring equal financial control. It's also doing better on reducing the gender gap in employment, even though the unemployment rate has remained unchanged. But the country is slipping on poverty, hunger, and access to medical care and clean water. Trust in state institutions has declined. Perceived corruption among these institutions has remained unchanged. And payment of bribes for public services has worsened. So in conclusion, I know that I've been talking for a while, but that was just a very quick and brief overview of everything that the SDG scorecards entail and that we are releasing today. The scorecards may be accessed on the Afrobarometer SDG scorecards page and on the individual country pages of the Afrobarometer website, which is www.afrobarometer.org. And just a few remarks in closing. As we said, the SDGs ultimately are intended as a tool to improve the lives of real people. Numerous important indicators and scorecards are being used to track progress, but Afrobarometer SDG scorecards are unique in highlighting the perspective of ordinary citizens who are the intended beneficiaries of the SDGs. Considering how these citizen assessments compare or contrast to other SDG indicators should stimulate debate, help identify gaps, and support action to move each country forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dominique, for such an insightful presentation. I think I myself have sort of picked up on a number of interesting data points, like South Africa improving on climate change awareness, which means the work that we've been doing does not go to waste. Colleagues, more than anything, I just want to remind everyone that the session is currently being recorded and streamlined live on YouTube and the Afrobarometer Facebook page. Again, I do encourage you to please kindly tweet, to please kindly share the conversation, and hashtag Voices Africa and hashtag SDG on all social media platforms that you can post on. If you do have any questions, please use the Q&A feature to type your questions. I will then at the end of the discussion sort of read out the questions, and the participants, or rather the panelists will answer to these questions. I think one thing, Dominic, that I want to stress more than anything to everyone is that the Afrobarometer SDG scorecards are not intended to sort of replace any official indicators that are currently tracking the SDGs, or rather that are currently tracking progress towards these SDGs, but rather what the Afrobarometer scorecards sort of do is to provide an additional perspective, one that is normally or rather usually missing from other sources, or even usually missing from the current discussions that are comparing, or rather that are currently looking at the progress of these one indicators. And therefore, these SDGs are intended, as you mentioned, sort of to enrich the discussion, to make sure that the voices of the ordinary citizen, or rather the voices of the ordinary African, is sort of represented in these high-level discussions, because that's always what's missing. So without wasting any further time, currently I am joined by Dion Shikuza, who's a youth advocate for sustainable development, as a panelist. We also have Siabata Mutsanai, who's the executive director of the Lesotho Council of NGOs, Mandipon Robu, who's a governance and policy researcher. Again, we have Dr. Malebo Bakwena, who's the head of the Department of Economics at the University of Botswana. I think we have a very incredible group of people to sort of help us unpack this data, or rather unpack this SDG scorecard that Dominic has sort of shared with us. To sort of kickstart the discussion, colleagues, I just wanted to ask, which of the findings did you find most interesting from your own perspective? And again, here you can choose a specific country, but which one did sort of stand out the most that was presented by Dominic? And I'm going to start with you, Manjipa, and then we'll go to Dion, and then we'll go to Dr. Bakwena and Siabata at the end.
Thanks, Gugu, for giving me the floor, and thank you to Afrobarometer for such insightful data. I think it's really important that we mainstream citizens' voices into such high-level discussions, as you've said, Gugu, and as Afrobarometer continues to do in its work. So which of the findings do I find most interesting? So I sit down and I look at this at a more holistic level, and I bring it back to my country as well. So as countries continue to battle the global health pandemic, the parallel legacy of ill-administered governance in countries like Zimbabwe has amplified systemic shortfalls in providing social protections. And this in and of itself stands as its own pandemic. So Dominic spoke to the tripling of those that go without healthcare, and the need for healthcare in Zimbabwe has actually worsened. And this is highlighted, and it's in Dominic's presentation, and it's a clear indicator of the fact that despite Zimbabwe's lauded vaccine rollout, there's a clear, deeper and underlying systemic problem. So just because there is progress in one area of healthcare within a specific period during the pandemic, which is a reactive response, we need to be more cautious and resilient in looking at the more systemic factors that have contributed to, stats such as tripling of those going without healthcare. So, I then sit back and think, ordinary African citizens are clearly still left out as the other in social contracts with governments who are meant to safeguard their existences. And that disconnect caused by inherent othering by ruling elites and their approaches to social justice continues to amplify inequalities that existed prior to COVID-19. And COVID-19 presents an opportunity to address those.
I definitely agree with you, Maddie. We'll go to Dion, and then we'll go to Dr. Bakwena, and then last but not least,
Thank you, Chair, for this question. I also echo the previous introductory remarks by Ms. Global in terms of the quality of the data. For me, the most, perhaps I'll start by saying, I remember in 2014, before the SDGs were launched, we were doing a survey in South Africa with the United Nations Foundation, basically just on the general awareness of what the SDGs are amongst people. And very few actually understood, even had a clue what SDGs are. And I would like to highlight that as a very important point to also understand the relevance of citizens in countries achieving SDGs. And I think they can help put pressure and hold to account most governments or assist where there's a lack of. The most striking one for me is unemployment, given that the young people or the youth population is increasing. And especially SADC or Africa, Sub-Sahara, is a very youthful bulge. And I think the fact that most institutions in terms of governments are not able to create employment, it's a bit of a worrying trend because the industries are also mostly old industries like mining, and most of them also reaching a sunset clause or their time of operation. And I think it worries a young person to think about where exactly are the future jobs coming from if this is how the trend is currently going. The other issue I found interesting is that smaller economies were performing better in certain areas than the bigger economies, like Eswatini doing good on gender and technology, Lesotho on electricity. And I think I would have expected bigger economies like South Africa to actually be doing better on those targets. But it probably also says a lot about how good governance and strong institutions are not enough, and that where this, for example, you look at a country like Zimbabwe, you would expect them to perform a little bit less in some areas, but they would actually outperform certain countries like in education. And yet where there's peace in countries like Namibia and South Africa, we're having a tougher time in some of these targets. So I think there's probably something that needs to be reanalyzed, because when you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals report, some of these countries are scoring better on those targets than they are on the Afrobarometer scorecards. So it means we probably need to be a bit more Pan-African with our targets so that they can be relevant to the people, and try and not stick too much to the international target that is often sometimes missing the local context. I also wanted to find out how the issue of the post-apartheid societies like Namibia, I think the two of them have specific challenges which often go unhighlighted or discussed, which I think are hampering and stopping these two countries from reaching some of their targets, because they do pretty well on a lot of stuff, but inequality seems to be one of the biggest challenges for a very long time now, and especially post the pandemic, we can imagine how it has increased. So I was a bit surprised at the differences of how smaller economies were outperforming others. Unemployment, I haven't seen stronger trend slowing down. And also, as I mentioned, how the historical injustices have actually hampered some of these two economies.
Thank you so much, Dion. Colleague, can I kindly ask that we do keep our responses a bit short of the discussion. There's still quite a lot of things that we need to unpack. So this first round of questions, can you just a snapshot of the most interesting sort of findings that were shared by Dr. Vakwena, and then yeah.
Thank you, Gugu. I have two interesting finds from the data, the rich data. This first one is linked to Dion's point on youth unemployment. Countries like South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, and Eswatini have come up with several youth employment initiatives, but youth unemployment is still very high, or it's at an alarming rate. So one might then wonder what is really happening. Is it, you know, are we missing the target, or do we have to do more in that regard? The other interesting point that I picked from the data is the issue of gender equality. Still, despite concerted effort by African countries, and as well as increase in labor force participation by females, gender equality is still widening. You still have inequality in terms of the pay, for instance, especially in the private sectors. So, you know, though, yes, countries individually have made progress and they're making progress, there is still a lot more that needs to be done in those areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vakwena. We'll come to you. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks very much, and everybody. Perhaps there are key findings that perhaps have taken my interest in this regard. I think the first one is already what has been said in terms of youth unemployment. I consider that as a major challenge facing a number of countries in the region, particularly as you see that it is linked to the other SDGs, such as reductions of poverty, and also in terms of the service delivery, as we talked about electricity and education. Because the key issue for me is whether Lesotho has moved well in terms of provision of electricity, access to education. The question that always remains with us is that electricity for what? Education for what? Because these two essential services helps us to forge strategies in terms of how we are going to fight poverty, how to eradicate unemployment of the youth. So the skills that we get from education has to be seen playing its role in terms of changing the lives of the citizens, because the SDGs are meant to improve the lives of us as citizens. I think that's how I have seen it, to say that there are gaps that perhaps we need to reconsider as we plan for the future, to say how best can we link the issue of education, access to energy, together with helping us to generate jobs, so that those jobs will help us to eradicate poverty, and then we reduce unemployment. I think that's what struck me that much, really, to say the linkages, we should really thinking about them, much as we can progress well to other SDGs, but there are certain that has to be an input to the major ones, such as unemployment and the issue of poverty reduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think one thing that's sort of based on the responses that are coming through, one thing that's sort of coming through the most for me is the unemployment issue, right? And I guess in line with the International Youth Day, which was celebrated on the 12th of August this month, even Afrobarometer shared the most recent findings that show that for the past couple of years, when Afrobarometer sort of tracked this data point, unemployment has sort of been consistently being cited as the most important problem that young Africans want their governments to sort of resolve and even to address. And obviously following other problems or other issues that are, such as crime, health, and so forth. However, what I'm trying to get to is the fact that these SDG scorecards that have just been presented now by Dominique show that most countries are doing very terribly, or rather worse, when it comes to the progress on reducing unemployment. And I think most of you colleagues have sort of alluded and even noted to that. What I want to find out from you is what do you think contributes to this worrying trend, or rather what can be done to sort of reverse this trend of unemployment in Africa, especially youth unemployment per se. And I think we can, I'm not going to point out anyone who feels a bit strongly to answer this question can take this question.
I'll go for it. So reflecting, there was a big uproar and upheaval when South Africa released its unemployment rates for the first quarter of 2021 at 32.6%. And I think back to 2018, where I sat at the Ibrahim Index of African Governance launch in Pretoria and quoted Afrobarometer data at the time, which said that 62% of South Africans, by the way, the economic powerhouse of the region and one of the strongest economies in sub-Saharan Africa, 62% of South Africans were willing to give up democratic freedoms in exchange for job security. And that is shocking, right? The signs were clearly there and they were pre-existing. Governments should do well to reduce bureaucratic red tape, lack of financing to SMEs, who are creating jobs for tomorrow. And this is linked to increased patron-client relations within elite political settlements and their networks that uphold them. This monocropping of policies that don't align with contextual issues on the ground. I mean, Dion was talking about being Pan-African. We have Agenda 2063, but our policies are not aligning to amplify things in a contextual way. Insufficient data or the lack of mainstreaming of scaling of available data, such as this data set and others, to diagnose the magnitude of the problem, right? And Africa could expect its annual gross domestic product, its annual GDP per capita to grow by up to 0.5 percentage point by 2030 if enough jobs are created for its young people. And we have a lot of young people entering the workforce. By 2033, we're expecting 30 million people per annum into the workforce. That's a lot of people. Where are we going to put them, right? So, despite this, according to the Ibrahim Forum report, which was assessing the impact of COVID-19 in Africa a year on, the pandemic has not only created new obstacles, but has also exacerbated pre-existing challenges for maximizing the continent's demographic dividend. And we do well to address these issues. I think the key thing lies in cooperation with young people already trying to do things on the ground and not just conversations.
Sure, if there's anyone who wants to take that one. No, okay. I think, Mandy, one thing that you sort of touched on more strongly, and I like the fact that it sort of links to my next question that's directed to you, Dr. Mapwena, is the issue of meaning, or rather the lack of meaningful youth inclusion and meaningful youth participation in our continent, right? And I think in us trying to find the solutions, and us trying to find solutions for Africa, or not necessarily even on a much more context-specific focus, we need to engage young people. And I enjoy the fact that you sort of brought that in, that solutions for Africa should include young people at the table, especially considering that almost a majority, more than half of the population in Africa is young people. I want to ask you, colleagues, if you think young people are currently engaged enough to push towards this SDG that sort of speaks to employment. Do you think they're doing enough, or this issue of gap, or rather lack of inclusion and meaningful participation is the barrier towards young people being active in terms of addressing this issue of unemployment? I'll go to you, Dion, then I'll speak to you, Dr. Mapwena, as well, based on the work that you're currently doing.
Thank you, Chair. I couldn't also take away from what Ms. Ndlovu said. She put it quite well. And I'll start by saying there's more work that needs to be done, especially as African youth, because in my experience, youth from other continents have they have a little bit more of a listening ear than we do, whereas in Africa, a lot of things depend on your background academically, who you know, your elite status in society, and I think most of these things make it really difficult for the youth that need the employment to get the support. Like in my view, youth living in informal settlements, rural-based youth. There was a question about youth living with disabilities. You can imagine this group is going to be marginalized twice if those who are coming out of educations of higher learning are already not getting the opportunity. And I think we need to be taken a little bit more serious, because there's this idea that young people need to be developed on behalf of somebody needs to help us get a job. And I think perhaps what's also missing is the fact that the sectors that young people are interested in are also not in the policies. Young people are now in very new sectors, ICT based. And I think most of those interests, arts, for example, and crafts, these are areas that I've seen young people are going into. Even if you look at the list of wealthy African Americans, most of them are in the arts and entertainment sector. And I know Africa has a lot of creative force and talent and potential therein. But do we see government policies that are actually trying to support young people there? Because if we keep wanting every young person to get a master's degree and a PhD in order to employ them, we might wait forever, or we might not solve the issues that these young people were anyways passionate and interested about. So I think very important is to first dialogue with those that are already doing activities, figure out what's the narrative baseline, what have they done, what's missing, and then from there, because sometimes government is like the force they wield is so much that sometimes they could spoil a youth initiative by just coming in and running the wholesale thing. I found it a bit awkward when big institutions do something for youth, but they don't think, why don't we empower a smaller organization to run that part of the project? Because that's how you build their capacity, that's how you expose them to new networks, that's how they learn how to do things. Because if you do things for us and send us back to our homes, we'll just wait for the next opportunity and apply again to attend that fellowship or that training. It's important that the tools are put in our hands and then we work from there. Thank you, Gugu.
Thank you so much, Dion. Thank you so much, Dion. I think Dr. Bakwana, I want to come straight to you after this one, because it does speak to the issue around our respective African economies, right? As an economist yourself, who is one passionate about poverty alleviation and obviously the finding of solutions for other socioeconomic issues in Africa, these Afrobarometer scorecards, or rather these country scorecards that have just been shared with us this morning, show the more than anything worsening challenges related to poverty, hunger, and obviously access to medical care in some respective countries that Dominique sort of presented to us. Botswana is the only country that is showing positive results for most of these indicators. And does this sort of, I want to find out from you if this sort of corroborates with your findings on African economies, and if so, again, because Botswana is obviously doing well based on the scorecards, what can other Southern African countries sort of learn from Botswana, take away from Botswana to sort of improve their own way of doing things when it comes to socioeconomic issues in their respective countries?
Yes, I would say that it corroborates what's on the ground or existing literature. But just to note, Gugu, that Botswana is experiencing the same issues, just like all the other countries, but maybe to a lesser extent. Why am I saying we're experiencing the same issues? For instance, just like Lesotho, we're experiencing or we are struggling with food adequacy. There's no food security. In fact, in 2020, the Global Hunger Index classified Botswana as facing serious hunger. That's an anomaly for a middle-income country like Botswana. Because if you take instances like Namibia and South Africa, who are on the same page in terms of the levels of economic development, they experience some hunger, but it's at a moderate level. However, your next question is, what can be learned from Botswana? How can other countries then lessen the issues that they are facing. Botswana has come up with many initiatives to address different aspects of the SDGs. For instance, in terms of hunger, there are special initiatives for that. There's the, what do you call magic? Let me try to check. The vulnerable groups feeding program for those people who are vulnerable in society, they get to be fed. Malnourished kids, they get to be fed in their clinics and so on and so forth. To address the issue of gender inequality, there is a women's economic empowerment program that is meant to assist or uplift and upskill women in Botswana, and many other initiatives. For instance, for poverty, there is a poverty eradication program that helps vulnerable Botswana to start their own businesses, start some form of backyard gardening. It also helps with the issue of nutrition and poverty in general. And other initiatives are for the youth in terms of unemployment, in terms of security, in terms of youth unemployment, there's the Youth Development Fund, and for food security, there's the Young Farmers Fund. So we are not there yet, but in terms of trying to alleviate these issues, there are certain initiatives and programs that are intended to target specific issues that Botswana are facing, so that we then don't leave nobody behind as per the SDG principles. Thank you, Gugu.
Thank you so much. Siabata, do you have anything to sort of add to this discussion around the lessons that we sort of need to take, or other from some countries we're doing well in terms of improving our economic development in these respective countries, and this might not necessarily be just lessons from Botswana, but even other countries as well.
Yes, thank you, Gugu. Perhaps one of the things is we need also to put this in the context of different countries in the region in their approach to economic development, and also engaging the young people to be the vehicle for economic development. You will recall that countries do have priorities, and they make the priorities. If they don't prioritize unemployment as a huge challenge for its citizens, then the priority is wrong. Because as you can look in our context in Lesotho, this is a time bomb now at the moment. Because the young people, who particularly the graduates, have started to organize themselves so that they can become a social movement that will demand the jobs anywhere in the country. And then they even say to the government, declare unemployment as an emergency, so that we can be able to find that we are also put into the system. But the inability of the government to adequately respond to that, I see it in the next 1 year or so as a crisis in a number of countries. That's how I see it. Because we need to opt for diversification of our interventions, targeting young people with different skills, so that we can occupy them and then see how best they can contribute to our economy. As I said, we need to engage them. We need to talk and then create platforms where they can be able to express themselves, and then also even progressively to take them in terms of saying, for the graduates, this is how we can do. For unskilled labor, this is what we can do. So then you have those segmentations, then perhaps progressively will be there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I actually want to have a follow-up question to that, but I want to jump straight to you, Mandipa. Mandipa, as a governance researcher whose interest or other areas of focus do include sustainable development or other sustainable economic development more than anything, Can you please sort of share your views on the regression that we're sort of seeing on this data, on these socioeconomic sort of related indicators such as poverty, hunger, and even unemployment? And then I'm going to quickly come back to you again, Sebata.
Sorry, I hadn't unmuted myself there. Just linking into what we were previously discussing is, young people continue to be at the forefront of changing their own narrative, right? So young people are leaders in the digital revolution and fighting for climate change and ensuring social protections for themselves. And within the digital revolution, we're looking at fintech, agri-tech, and things like that. But governments across Africa continue to fail their young people as the political will to address these main drivers of growth and employment through robust, engagement with informal economies is found consistently lacking, right? Despite this, the informal sector contributes 55% of sub-Saharan Africa's GDP and 80% of its labor force, right? I can't stress how huge these numbers are. They're statistics, but in real terms, it's a massive impact. And young people who are low skilled, self-employed, in urban or rural areas and seek refuge in survival and economic activities have limited access to resources and networks and few employment prospects other than informal and vulnerable economic activities. I mean, to quantify the seriousness of this matter, 93.4% of Africa's youth work in the informal sector, according to the ILO. 11.2% of Africans aged 15 to 24 were unemployed in 2019, and the AU estimates that 20 million jobs may be lost in Africa due to COVID-19. These all impact the precarity of the largest demographic and the biggest engine to social recovery post-COVID-19 in Africa and in the Southern African region. Where the term youth is used to describe a transitional period from a state of dependence to independence, we need to start asking ourselves whether the period, which is usually expunged by the age of 35, so after 35, you're not technically considered a youth, right? Can this same age be used as a determinant economically? Because clearly, even at the age of 35, people are still struggling, right? So what are we quantifying as youth by age economically, right? Looking again at Now Generation Network survey statistics from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, after, economic instability, which sits at 79%, which was the biggest challenge during the pandemic. Unemployment was the second biggest challenge at 66% of the cohort, citing it as the largest concern, right? With the cost of food rising due to global supply chain challenges, amongst other things, economic access sits as a valuable indicator to deduce progress. And, with worsening unemployment and continued mismatch of skills to the job market, it's clearly a worrying trend.
Okay, so I definitely agree with you. I want to come to you again, Sebata, on this. And that you mentioned the issue of engagement. And what Mandy is sort of touching on right now is the governance gap problem that Africa sort of has. And I think Mo Ibrahim has sort of done quite a number of interesting sort of reports on it. On the engagement aspect of it, surprisingly, in as much as we are kind in this conversation, sort of advocating or even speaking on the lack of inclusion of young people in this discussion, it's so shocking to me that even the latest Afrobarometer research, or rather the latest Afrobarometer data, show that almost 6 in 10 respondents that were surveyed, which is 58%, agreed or even strongly agreed that in order for their respective countries to do well, they should still listen to the wisdom of the elders, right? And only 37% say that we should be prioritizing listening to fresh ideas of young people. I mean, this is data from the ground, right? So in as much as we are having this discussion and sort of saying that we are advocating and pushing for young people, but the people on the ground are actually saying, nah, actually these young people, they can chill a bit. That's, for me, that's worrying. That's worrying numbers, right? But what I want to bring you on, Sebata, is on the role of civil society organizations, because I definitely want to believe that in order for Africa to move forward and in order for us to do well as Africa, we need all levels of community to sort of be involved in coming up with solutions for Africa. So what I want to ask you is, what has been the role of CSOs, or rather civil society organizations, in sort of ensuring the progress towards some of these SDGs?
Thanks very much. Perhaps one will say there are key interventions that civil society are driving in relation to these SDGs. In particular, we can talk about SDG 4 in relation to education. If I can recall well that we undertook a study in terms of domestic financing for study for education, of which we are looking whether government is contributing the adequate resources for education and also to meeting the SDG 4. And based on that, we also added another intervention where we're looking at the education financing model comparative study in the SADC region, where we look at how the Lesotho is performing. We're looking at this from the point of view of civil society so that it can inform us when we are doing our advocacy for access to education, particularly not only quality education. So how best can we do that? Because we are aware that the output of this intervention has a direct link to the issue of unemployment. So those are the kind of the interventions that we also took in the past years. And looking again to the issue of participation, Lesotho currently is undertaking the reforms agenda, of which now, based on the notion that leaving no one behind, the youth are taking more center stage in terms of their groups and input into that. So that's what us as part of civil society, we've been pushing and then persuading to say that we look at the gaps that also are done and then be able to take it from there. While others, yes, it's still the issue of skill provision. I must admit that based on your revelations or findings in this study, where the issue of poverty now has now shaken us to say we need to go and now talk about the issue of hunger, the issue of poverty, so that we are also being able to put the government into that. We haven't been strong into that, but it is others in terms of the issue of peace, the issue of democracy and all that. We have been playing a very critical role into that. So now one is realizing that we now need to focus more on this one so that we can be able to move forward. Thanks.
Agreed, I agree totally with you. Colleagues, just to remind everyone to put your questions on the Q&A section of the webinar so that we are able to direct these to the panelists. Again, to just remind you to tag at Afrobarometer on Twitter and other social media platforms. You share some of the points that are coming out from this amazing discussion, and you can hashtag Voices Africa and hashtag SDG as well. Dion, let me come straight to you on this one. On the engagement of various levels, or rather engagement of various civil society or even community, I want to bring in, based on your experience of serving of various UN platforms, do you think that governments and advocates have been effective in engaging with the public to promote to promote the 2030 agenda goals? And which areas would you sort of highlight as being particularly successful or even particularly challenging in this engagement? So I want you to bring in, to tie in this question, or rather your responses to the engagement of other civil society organizations in terms of how well is government or other advocates sort of working effectively in bringing the general public in promoting this 2030 agenda.
Thank you, Gugu. Yes, I would say they've been effective, but there's still a need for efficiency, because advocates in general, I would best identify them as freelancers or active agents for sustainable development. And as such, they lack convening power. For example, as an advocate, it's really difficult for you to get big institutions together in one room. So I think there's also a very important requirement or need for governments to partner with advocates, especially when it comes to research and data, so that they are able to use quantified information and relevant statistics when they are engaging the public or different stakeholders. Secondly, advocates are also financially, there's basically, if you look at the whole sustainable development financing mechanism, or finance for development as it's called, you would find that it rarely is there support for groups like this. Often the funding is going towards sectors like energy, water, and so forth. But when the implementation of that happens, the civil society is often expected to gather their own funding and their own resources and mobilize that in order to engage the public. I think sustainable development is a costly exercise, especially in a sub-Saharan African perspective, where you have to travel distances to populated places that are often far from each other. And fourthly, I think advocates also need to be part of the whole mailing system. Basically, I think they need access to information that is pertained towards only those who are working for government institutions, like a minister, for example. I think sometimes it's important that the civil society is also aware of this. Like, for example, even these Afrobarometer scorecards, it's very rare that you would find civil society at the forefront of this, or even informed. I think trainings, workshops for civil society would be very important, looking at the fact that civil society is becoming younger by the day, because as mentioned earlier, young people are taking up the agency themselves to become this movement of social requirements, the government. So I would say there needs to be these partnerships. We need to appoint advocates or activists for sustainable development as ambassadors, the way the UN has done at an international level, where they engage prolific and influential people to support them on particular goals. I haven't seen that in African governments a lot. I think it's important to consider the power of day-to-day action, talking to individuals. If you're in a public transport vehicle, if you are at a salon, I think most of these dialogues are only carried best by those on the ground, like advocates, who often have access to the people and have the trust of the people as well, because we also saw from the scorecards that the perceived corruption or trust in key institutions is also in some states not there. And I think that's where advocates would come in to support the government and build that trust with communities. So for me, they are effective, but they are not efficient, because the press also plays a role. I think the media and the advocates also need to combine themselves pretty well in order to reach a broader demographic. So I would answer it like that for now, that it's effective, but it requires more efficiency and partnership, stronger partnership, not just the civil society-based partnership, but one that has a long-term plan included in national development plans as well. I think that's how I'll put it from.
Thank you so much, Dion. I think you sort of touched on my next question, which was going to be around basically the use of these SDG scorecards by civil society. And this was basically going to be directed to everyone, but you sort of touched on. And I think what I said in the beginning is that these Afrobarometer SDG scorecards are not intended to sort of replace what is kind of being used, or rather any other official indicators that are tracking progress towards this SDGs. But more than anything, they are providing an additional perspective. They are bringing the voice of the African ordinary citizen. And that sort of highlights the importance of it, not just in governance and UN institutions, but even by civil society organizations, faith-based organizations, and society at large, right? So I'm not going to sort of dive back into that question based on time. Colleagues, I want to use this last few minutes of this part of the discussion to touch on the most important things. I understand the majority of what we've been conversation we've been having on really are important problems. But the issue of gender inequality and the issue of climate change in Africa, I need us to have a conversation on that. And I'm going to come to you, Dr. Bakwena. I want us to touch on the findings when it comes to gender equality. Since you've been sort of championing equal rights for and opportunities for women, these Afrobarometer SDG scorecards sort of show an impressive progress towards gender equality in technology use and financial control in employment in respective countries such as Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Lesotho. But we still do see some persistent sort of gender gaps. And also some sort of mixed progress in some countries when it comes to achieving gender equality or even gender parity, right? So what I want to ask is, from your experience, what are some of the barriers to gender equality in Africa? And if you can, please do give me some country-specific or even
Gugu, generally, the main issue is that women are not part of the decision-making process. What does that mean? It means we are basically, or women are basically underrepresented in the political sphere. And in the case of Botswana, in terms of key ministries. So the examples I'm going to give here, you wanted me to be country specific, so I'll be specific to Botswana solely because I have a UNDP 2021 report on gender inequality or inequality in general in Botswana. So that's the first one. If you are not a decision maker, it means that somebody makes the decisions for you. So that's the main issue. The second one is the gender pay gap. And it's mainly because of segregation of women in lower paid and lower valued sectors in the labor market. Women tend to choose certain jobs that are lower paying, and therefore, of course, the pay is also lower. And the third one is just the nature of being a woman. As a woman, you are, or generally a woman is a nurturer. And because of that nurturing nature, women are overburdened with the caring responsibility. So therefore, there is that balance between, for instance, work, if you have to work, and of course, caring for, aged parents and so on and so forth. And in the case of Botswana, I would say also it's gender inequality is considered as external to Botswana's cultural norms and traditions. What does that mean? Botswana tend to picture or have this stereotype that women advocating for increased gender equality are either single, divorced, or married to foreigners. That's as per a UNDP 2012 study that we have that label that, okay, she's probably single, she's probably married to a foreigner. That's why she has the guts to talk to people about gender inequality. So it's something that is not freely discussed in society. So those are the four major points when it comes to gender inequality.
I think one thing that is also very important is the fact that the term gender in Africa is a term that we still need to sort of unpack and sort of understand what it means for us, and not sort of adopting an international explanation of gender. Because one thing that I do know is that gender is one, a social construct, and in Africa we still, in some terms, it carries quite a lot of weight based on some of the roles that women are sort of take on in respective contexts and in respective communities because of their gender. So I think this is another discussion for another day, Afrobarometer colleagues, that we need to build up on. It's an important discussion, especially because we cannot leave gender, we cannot leave young people in any discussion that we're having. I'm very cognizant of time, and I still have quite a lot of questions, but I cannot leave without asking this one. Because it's also one that's going to not necessarily impact us now, but also it's something we're seeing its effects very present in our lives, and it's the issue of climate change. And Dion, you are a youth advocate for SDGs, right, with a particular interest and sort of expertise in climate action. So I want us to talk specifically about SDG 13, right? On the 9th of August, right, the IPCC report was published. And it sort of showed that the rate, or rather the rate of surface temperature has sort of increased and generally more rapidly in Africa, and is affecting majority of Africans. What I want to ask you, based on the Afrobarometer scorecards, the country scorecards that we shared today, what we're seeing is that, well, with the exception of Eswatini, all of Southern African countries have sort of seen an increase in the awareness of negative impacts of climate change. Does this, or rather does this data by these scorecards sort of reflect the UN's findings on progress towards climate action?
Thank you. First and foremost, the IPCC report that they just released was entirely based on the goals that were agreed on within the climate change negotiations to keep the global temperature limit to below 2 degrees Celsius. But as countries that are more vulnerable, there was a push to rather look at 1.5, because 1.5 for some countries would almost be 2 degrees Celsius for others, especially us that are more vulnerable. So the one thing in my experience as a junior delegate in the climate change delegation for Namibia to the Conference of Parties, I've also seen one of the elements or agenda items that's quickly adopted and accepted by parties is the one on what they call action for climate empowerment, which is education, awareness raising, training, international cooperation, and so forth. And this is mostly because this does not really have much to do with reducing that 2 degrees Celsius, apart from the change in norm of behavior in society. So that means the scorecard of the barometers rather looked at something similar to that action for climate empowerment. It rather asked the perception of people's understanding on climate change, if it's impacting negatively or positively. In most cases, you will get support from governments to get such goals. But the real issues like changing sectors and investing aggressively, or asking developed parties or developed countries to commit to their financial obligations so that poorer countries can actually mitigate or adapt, that is the tough one. So I'll say no, it does not reflect because the barometer scorecard rather wanted to know from a point of education and public awareness. But what the IPCC report was looking at was how are the governments committing their resources and technologies and government policies and so forth, so that they could convert themselves into a greener sector. And that is happening much slower. And it's easier said than done, because it gets trickier at these negotiations. And as African governments, we have a tougher challenge because we don't have the funds, but we are carrying the highest or the most brunt of climate change impacts. So I would say no. But if the IPCC report was trying to reflect whether people understand and governments are educating the people on climate change, then I would say yes. But based on that, I'd say no. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Afrobarometer also has a Pan-African profile that speaks specifically on climate literacy in Africa. And I think for me, it was very interesting, specifically for South Africa, to see that we made some progress in the understanding of climate. Because one thing that I do know is that for Africa to move towards for Africa to work to build resilience on climate change effects, it needs to be working with the population that understands the impacts of climate change, that knows what climate change is, and also has ways in terms of how they can contribute towards the mitigation and even the adaptation to these climate change effects. So I'm glad to touch base on. But then again, Afrobarometer, this is another discussion that needs to happen on climate change and young people and bringing women to the table as well. Dominic, I think one last question, and then we're going to go to the questions in the Q&A that I want to sort of bring forth to you. If governments and international organizations already collect lots of data on the economy, the health sector, unemployment, and other areas around government, why do we need this additional Afrobarometer data? And specifically about how ordinary people sort of see things. So I want us to wrap up this discussion on sort of highlighting the importance of this Afrobarometer data and these Afrobarometer scorecards in this greater scheme of conversations that we have in pertaining all these issues that I just mentioned.
Thank you so much, Gugu. And this has really been a lively discussion. I think we both mentioned it earlier on in the presentation. And I think the main contribution that Afrobarometer wants to make is to bring in the perspectives of citizens. A lot of the other indicators that are currently tracking SDGs are based on figures, based on, how many miles of roads were built, how many, people had access to grants, et cetera. And what Afrobarometer has done is to bring in how people have interacted with those particular services that government offers, how people have interacted with their government, how they perceive their government to be performing, and the challenges that they have in accessing some of the basic services, basic human services, and some of the SDG goals that are linked to SDG goals. So in summary, I would just say that is Afrobarometer's main contribution, is bringing the voice of the average citizen into the conversation about SDG goals and progress that's made in country towards achieving those goals.
I think going through the discussion, Dominic, you don't need to unmute yourself because this one will come to you as well. There's a question that's coming from Active Place, and I think you've sort of touched base on it. Is what role can we as researchers and members of the Afrobarometer network sort of play to advance the SDG agenda in our respective countries?
I would say, well, for our partners, now that the scorecards are available, I would encourage each partner to actually have a country-specific release, and to disseminate the information as widely as possible, especially to governments, especially to donors, people who are in charge of the money and where the money flows, to ensure that these things happen, basically. For researchers in general, I would say that one of the things that Afrobarometer isn't able to capture in our surveys is answering those why questions. So if one of our questions that we ask, for instance, is what are some of the most important problems that you want government to address? I think you did touch on that earlier, Gugu. And people will list 2 or 3 responses, but we don't have space or scope within our questionnaire to actually ask, why do you consider this to be the most important problem? And I think that's where a huge contribution that can really build on some of the findings that we have can come from researchers. And so answer the why questions, ask them, answer them, and share your findings as widely as possible, I'd say.
Yeah, I agree with you. Dominic. And I think the beauty about Afrobarometer data is the fact that you can sort of disaggregate the data by different social demographics. So if you are interested in youth, to say you can sort of disaggregate that specific data point to go and pack for your respective work. If you're interested in the gender aspect of it, you are able to show that as well. I think there's another question, and let me try to read it. And again, it's probably coming to you, Dominique. Again, what is your summation on the progress of the SDGs, on target or not, or overall?
This might be a bit of an academic way of answering this question, but it's very difficult to paint an overall picture of what's going on in Southern Africa, because progress is so mixed. So you have some countries that are performing really well and other countries that are not doing that well. And because these scorecards aren't intended to compare across countries, it's difficult to lump everything together to say, this is how each country is doing. But if we look at specific indicators, like when looking at socioeconomic issues, for instance, hunger, poverty, unemployment, most countries are slipping, with the exception of Botswana. Most of the South African countries we've seen today are also slipping when it comes to trust in state institutions, perceived corruption among these institutions, and payment of bribes to access public services. And then contrasting that, when looking at indicators like education, for instance, we see that most countries are making progress, or at least some progress towards this particular SDG. South Africa and Namibia haven't made progress in that regard, because both of those countries are yellow, but it's not great, but yellow still means that there's no regression. So I would say overall, again, it's a bit difficult to paint one clear picture, and that just to emphasize that please don't compare countries to each other. It's for in-country comparison. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dominic. I think from my side, I'm going to have to close the discussion, but I just want 1 second wrap-up line from everyone. And who was in the panel, including you, Dominic, at the end, and then sort of close off. We are quite on time for our discussion to sort of wrap up, but I just want a snapshot from everyone in terms of where to from here from this webinar. So where to for everyone, for you, for Afrobarometer, just that short reflection from everyone, very quick, very brief. Mandy, I'll start with you.
Okay, sure. I'm just going to build very quickly on what Dominique said about corruption, and something that we didn't get to talk about quite extensively. And I think something to hone in, especially when thinking about distrust that citizens have with their governments, as Afrobarometer data is bringing out. You know, and then I guess the question would then be, have governments failed at tackling corruption? I think trust is built and it's earned, right? And governments tend to feel entitled to this trust from its citizens without doing the necessary work. And expressions of this trust, which designate accountability, must be data-driven as well in their access, and the respect for the rule of law must be upheld as well in building trust. And, you know, without this, unsustainable advancements towards social cohesion and subsequent advancements of the SDGs will be left in disarray, right? So it's really important to cling to things like that. And I think we need to, you know, I prefer not to say rather, you know, what are governments doing in terms of corruption, but really to think about the information that we're putting out there. Are governments in a state of denial that breeds complacency and a lack of political will at tackling corruption and subsequent citizen apathy? You know, we need to be thinking about those things as well. And just to wrap up, I can see your face, you're like, finish, but I see it. But, you know, public trust is key for effectiveness in response to any issue within society. So COVID-19, you know, the crisis has shown that high trust societies have tended to respond better because the social contract has been respected. And we need to be cognizant when we engage with these things, especially in Southern Africa, where we're all aware that corruption is rife currently.
Thank you, Mandy, for that very long response. Everyone, just a very brief one, quick one-liner so that we can wrap up. Yeah. Dr. Bakwena, Dion, and then Sabata.
Just a quick one to young people in Africa to keep on pushing to achieve the SDGs. There are so many movements from rather across Africa, from Botswana, Zambia, touching on the different aspects of the SDGs that are relevant to young Africans.
Thank you so much. Dion?
Thank you. In short, I'd encourage a transformation in the public sector that is a bit more empathetic, integrity, ethics. I think this could counter the citizens' apathy that was spoken of earlier. We need to enhance localizing the SDGs so that they can be owned by the people, because it's a bottom-up process. So I wish we invert the pyramid. And thirdly, I think we need to start supporting our governments, especially with the climate change challenge, because it could reverse the trends of all other development targets. And especially when we don't have the finances to actually fund most of these activities. So I think those 3 points is how I would leave it: a reform public sector, localization of the SDGs, and also more awareness in terms of capacity to do something on climate change. And the youth, of course, we keep championing our cause. Thank you.
Thank you, Dion.
That's good. I see more commitment from our side, particularly on the SDG 1 and 2, because as I've said, we haven't put much of our efforts to track the progress along those lines. So perhaps we'll see how best we can deal with that. I also agree with the sentiments regarding the issue of corruption. Is a key issue, and for us it's also an issue in the area of reforms, where we are trying to improve the legal framework so that we can have an institution that is strong and independent and that can be able to pursue the program and mandate as given. But thanks very much for the session. And then we hope that we'll try to see how best we can share notes and as we do localization in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, colleagues, for those who have attended and also for participating in this panel discussion. For everyone, the SDG scorecards are available on the Afrobarometer website for your own personal analysis. You can still, again, run the Afrobarometer data on the data analysis tool that's also on the Afrobarometer website. If you have any questions, do feel free to reach out to the Afrobarometer team. Again, share this on all your social media with any questions that you have and some of the key findings that are very important, or rather that spoke to you from this discussion. From my end, thank you so much for such a beautiful conversation and for the engagement. Hoping to have another conversation on some of the questions we had. So thank you so much. Have a good one.
Thank you, Gugu, and thank you everybody for being here.
Goodbye.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.